on Oversight and Investigations will come to order. Today's hearing is entitled Examining the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of subcommittee at any time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of this subcommittee may participate in today's hearing for the purposes of making an opening statement and questioning the witness. The chair now recognizes herself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. When a terrible disaster strikes, the federal government plays an important role when delivering much-needed emergency aid. Today's hearing is about a related point upon which we can all, I think, agree. It is critical to ensure that taxpayer money being spent on disaster relief is spent smartly, efficiently, and effectively. Every disaster relief dollar that is diverted to an inefficient or wasteful use is a dollar that is not going to help individuals in need, and that is wrong. The Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program is comprised of relief funds which are designated to allow communities to start the recovery process by helping those communities and neighborhoods with limited resources to rebuild critical infrastructure after a catastrophic event. Today's hearing will focus on whether the Department of Housing and Urban Development's administration of the CDBG DR program lives up to the ideals I mentioned a moment ago. It will also, I hope, initiate a constructive dialogue between Congress, HUD, and the HUD Office of Inspector General about how the CDBG DR program can be reformed to increase oversight, to increase accountability, and ensure disaster relief dollars go directly and expeditiously to those who need them the most. As we'll hear today from our witness, the acting HUD Inspector General, Helen Albert, the HUD OIG has routinely identified serious systemic problems with the CDBG Disaster Recovery Program. Money appropriated to this program often failed to reach those who need it most and instead was diverted to wasteful or inefficient uses. As a recent example, a 2017 OIG report on Hurricane Sandy revealed $450 million in questionable costs. The HUD OIG's important work has also documented instances of grantees who regularly failed to maintain proper documentation supporting the costs of performed work, as well as awarding duplicate or ineligible assistance. HUD OIG's work also demonstrates that these problems have occurred throughout the nation. Even in my own home state of Missouri, they've seen misuse of some of these funds. The OIG's work also reveals another troubling trend. $11.5 billion of CDBG DR funds appropriated for disasters going all the way back to September 11th remain unspent. While rebuilding communities isn't done overnight and takes time, at a certain point it appears that billions of dollars are simply sitting lost or forgotten about in grantee bank accounts. When put in context with the $7.4 billion Congress recently appropriated to HUD in the first relief package for Hurricane Harvey and Irma, Congress must do a better job recouping the lost money, so to speak, for future disasters. Again, disaster funds should go to those who need them most. And I am so pleased to see that it's not just the HUD OIG who recognizes that the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program needs reforms to ensure disaster funds reach disaster victims, but Secretary Carson understands these problems exist and is open to working to address them. In testimony before the full committee just weeks ago, Secretary Carson noted that some of the things done through the CDBG Disaster Recovery Program have been, in his words, questionable. Ms. Albert, I look forward to hearing your testimony and recommendations this morning, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time. I now recognize The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the witness for appearing as well. Madam Chair, you can't be the Secretary of HUD without being the Secretary of HUD. Let me explain. It's an honor to have the witness before us today, who will talk to us about some of our needs. She will talk to us about a good many issues related to waste, fraud, and abuse. She'll talk about procedures and processes. But there are some things that we have to talk about that relate to policy. As you indicated, the Secretary was here earlier, and he made some comments that would lead me to believe that he should return. It's my belief that the Secretary should return to this committee and visit with us, be prepared to answer questions about certain questionable policies related to HUD. And I hope that he will come, and such that he will not be surprised, I would like to give some indication as to the areas of concern. The areas of concern would include options for temporary and long-term housing for victims after a national disaster, types of construction standards we should require for public housing in areas where we have a history of severe weather or fires. We need to know more about the loss of private housing stock as it relates to Section 8 choice vouchers. We need to know more about the devastation of the housing stock in areas like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, where we have people who are suffering currently. What's happening in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands is shameful and sinful. We need to know more about this. Should low moderate income ratio be waived in the wake of disasters? The LMI is something that is set at 70%. Should we lower this given the lawsuits and settlements that we've had in this area? Protecting the housing of our nation's senior citizens when we have national disasters. Protecting the housing of the disabled when we have national disasters. We should talk about providing temporary housing assistance to HUD-assisted families that were displaced by storms. We should look at the cost, the estimated cost of HUD properties damaged. We need to know what we can do to repair and replace properties. These are some of the areas of concern that the Secretary should be concerned with and should be prepared to address. I believe that it is important for us to discuss waste, fraud, and abuse. And my hope is that we'll have a very fruitful discussion today. But I also know that Mr. Long, who is the FEMA director, Mr. Long, Brock Long, FEMA director, has appeared before the Senate Homeland Security Committee on yesterday for a hearing. And he'll be appearing tomorrow at the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. This is important. There are many things about waste, fraud, and abuse associated with FEMA that we can and should discuss. And my hope is that they will be discussed in this Congress. But I also know that his appearance before these committees has much to do with what's happening right now as it relates to the storms that we've had to encounter. What happened in Texas and Florida and the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico is of great importance to us. And just as Mr. Brock Long is testifying, the Secretary of HUD should be testifying as well. I know that the request was made for this hearing, and it's been set for some time. I'm okay with that, but I do believe that I shall now do something that's important, and that is make a request for us to bring the Secretary of HUD before the committee so that the Secretary can give some answers to questions of concern. I would also add this, that I would like, without objection, to place a letter in the record requesting that the Secretary appear, along with some of the areas of concern that we'd like for the Secretary to address. I opened by saying you can't be the Secretary of HUD without being the Secretary of HUD. This means that you can't secret yourself someplace at a time when your presence is needed elsewhere. You've got to appear and let the public know where you stand, where HUD stands, and what some of these policies are that we need to help you with. If there are things that we need to correct, let's talk about the correction process. If there are things that we cannot correct and we should eliminate, let's talk about these things as well. But the point to be made is we need to talk to the Secretary of HUD. You can't be the Secretary of HUD without appearing before the Financial Services Committee, which has oversight jurisdiction, and this committee, this subcommittee, has specific oversight jurisdiction, and we do ask that the Secretary appear. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the gentleman's letter will be submitted to the record without objection. The chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Wagner. Providing relief to Americans impacted by natural disaster is a critical function of Congress. Disaster relief can help Americans and their towns put their lives back on track after what are often life-altering disasters. While fulfilling this critical function, however, we must also remember to fulfill another charge: to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. In my home state of Colorado, community development block grants for disaster recovery have been used for flood and fire recovery programs. These programs, addressing housing, infrastructure, planning, and economic development needs, have proven to be effective tools in responding to the aftermath of a disaster. In Colorado, the Department of Local Affairs administers CDBG-DR funding. I have confidence in the Department of Local Affairs to faithfully distribute these funds. I also believe that it is important that HUD have the ability to be able to track these dollars down to the local level, whether it be independently or working with state agencies. It's crucial that taxpayer dollars allocated for disaster relief are used for their intended purpose, and I look forward to learning how Congress can create more accountability in these programs here today. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We now welcome today's witness, Ms. Helen Albert. Helen Albert was appointed as the Acting Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development beginning in June of 2017. Ms. Albert previously served as the Deputy Inspector General of HUD and the Assistant Inspector General for Management and Policy. Prior to joining HUD, Ms. Albert was Director of External Operations at the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General and spent a decade in the U.S. Senate, where she served as Chief Investigator and professional staff for 2 Senate committees, primarily focusing on counter-narcotics and fraud-related issues. Ms. Albert is a native of New York City and received her Bachelor of Arts from the State University of New York at Binghamton. Without objection, the witness's written statement will be made a part of the record following her oral remarks. Once the witness has finished presenting her testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask questions. Ms. Albert, on your table, there are 3 lights. Green means go, yellow means you have 1 minute left, and red means your time is up. With that, the witness will now be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of her testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Wagner. Ranking Member Green and members of the subcommittee, I am Helen Albert, the Acting Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight our perspectives of HUD's oversight of disaster assistance funding, particularly in light of the immense challenges faced by this nation to respond to destructive hurricanes and fires. This country has never been hit by multiple hurricanes as strong as Harvey, Irma, and Maria, with other hurricanes hitting shortly after, in the same season in modern times. This has been followed by devastating wildfires, which, like the storms, have caused extensive destruction and loss of human life. As part of our initial response, our special agents, the federal law enforcement side of our agency, assisted in search and rescue efforts in Houston, teamed with disaster medical assistance units to be the first into the Keys, and helped locate unaccounted for HUD employees in the first areas where where helped unaccounted for HUD employees in all affected areas and delivered food and supplies to the elderly. Additionally, our auditors and evaluators with our agents are currently working to conduct quick capacity reviews to determine the ability of local entities to administer funds. I could not be more proud of the critical work our IG staff is undertaking. From 2001 till 16, Congress appropriated more than $47 billion in funding to address long-term recovery to HUD in the wake of a wide range of disasters, including the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Hurricane Katrina in 5, Hurricanes Ike and Gustav in 8, Hurricane Sandy in 12, and Hurricane Matthew in 16. In comparison, from 1993 to 9, HUD disaster funding totaled less than $1.7 billion. The states primarily used the funding to repair housing, compensate homeowners repair infrastructure, and provide economic development. We note for the last large disaster, now exactly 5 years ago, approximately 50% of Sandy funds are still unexpended. Over the years, HUD has gained more experience and has made progress with assisting communities, but faces significant challenges monitoring funds provided to various grantees, including states and cities. Oversight is made more difficult due to the diverse nature of projects and the fact that some can take 5 to 10 years to complete. HUD must be diligent to ensure grantees have identified timelines and are keeping up with them, and goals are met and expectations are achieved. But it continues to face the following challenges in administering these grants: ensuring that expenditures are eligible and supported, certifying that grantees are following procurement regulations, addressing concerns that citizens encounter when seeking assistance, and conducting consistent and sufficient monitoring efforts on grants. We have developed a series of integrity bulletins aimed at providing the grantees with information to help safeguard program funds and to ensure that communities get the full benefit of funding. The benefits were sent to grantees over the last 2 years and are posted on our website. We also recently developed a fraud alert for homeowners, which we hope that you will pass out to your constituents, on how to avoid scams and where to go if they need help. Additionally, our work on capacity studies has begun. We are conducting these to bring awareness to potential areas of waste, fraud, and abuse specific to the environments the department is about to enter. Finally, lessons learned from over 15 years of oversight activities lead us to an overarching recommendation to suggest codifying a single disaster recovery program at HUD in order to ensure a more permanent formal framework, to reduce the volume and provide consistency of notices used to provide informal guidance for each disaster, and to mitigate time delays in implementing guidance. In conclusion, Chairman Wagner, the department's role has greatly increased as it has had to deal with unanticipated disasters and economic crises that have, in addition to its other missions, increased its vital role in providing services that impact the lives of our citizens. My office is strongly committed to working with the department and Congress to ensure that the program operates efficiently and effectively and is intended for the benefits of Americans now and to the future. I look forward to answering all of your questions.
Chair thanks the witness for her opening statement, and the chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Albert, I wanted to spend my time discussing action plans submitted by states and how changes and revisions to stated guidelines invite potential misuse of CDBG disaster recovery funds. In your written testimony, you note that HUD has issued a number of waivers and accepted an even greater number of amendments or revisions to states' action plans. What are some of the issues with allowing HUD and the states to very easily revise plans to provide disaster recovery to victims?
Well, the department under the CDBG program actually needs flexibility. It has to have the ability to do things and allow localities, depending on the disaster, to be able to react in certain ways. However, when you allow these waiver upon waivers, and HUD has, along with FEMA actually, have waived quite a bit, what happens is you lose the intended purpose of the program.
Can you speak up a little bit? You say lose the intended purpose? Yes.
The intended purpose of the program. So for instance, in the state of Louisiana, there had been a grant program that was designed to elevate homes. A worthy program. Monies had already been given out to homeowners to renovate and rebuild. But in the flood zones, they wanted those areas to try and elevate so that if there was another flood, they could withstand it. What happened in that instance was we went and did a sample audit to see whether the elevation took place. It was about $650 million that was given for this intended purpose. We did a sample of about 199 homes, and when we went, 148 of the homes had not been elevated.
Wow.
So we had spoken to HUD, and we had asked them to actually recapture the funds because, frankly, it wasn't for the intended purpose. HUD cannot recapture. It only can recapture from the states because it signs an agreement with the grantee. What HUD did in that instance was they decided to change the intent of the program. So they said, well, if you can prove to us that you actually rehabilitated your home and/or elevated, we'll accept that, although the name of the program was home elevation. So then we went back and we said, okay, well then show us the documentation to show that the money was actually used to rehabilitate, because they had received other monies to do that. They could not do that. So after a variety of different, changing of the intended purposes, of waiving the, what had been put in the action plan to begin with, we ended up closing down that evaluation because we could not close out the finding and recommendation because it kept changing.
In your written testimony, you note that for Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, HUD accepted 66 amendments from Louisiana. For Hurricane Sandy, for Hurricane Sandy, accepted 17 amendments from New York. Are these extreme cases, or do states so frequently amend their action plans? And how often does HUD reject action plans or ask states to revise and resubmit them for review?
Sometimes they do reject. And one of the cases that I know Ranking Member Green mentioned had to do with low and moderate income. In the case of Texas, they actually did reject Southern Texas's action plan in the Valley because it did not meet some of the low and moderate income requirements. There were lawsuits, as he mentioned, and other things that had occurred. But they don't tend to do that often. They tend to accept the amendments. They believe that there's something called maximum feasible deference, which means that the locality or the grantee or the state, whoever is administering it, has deference to do with it pretty much as they think they need to, except in certain instances like LMI where they sought action, but that's not typical.
Ms. Albert, I have so many more questions, and I'll have to submit some for the record or do it in a second round, but let me ask one final question. Once a state has submitted an action plan and HUD accepts it, should HUD require unused funds under the action plan to be returned rather than have those dollars repurposed or the action plan amended to allow for more spending for new purpose?
Well, as a law enforcement agency and an auditing agency, we typically see that it usually takes about 6 to 8 years for redevelopment to take place. As money ages beyond that, that's when you start seeing more problems with the funds, more improper uses, more repurposing, finding uses for the money that's sitting there. There's $360 million still sitting from 9/11, which is now 16 years ago.
Wow.
At some point, you have to say, what was the intended purpose, and that's a whole other story about the action plans, whether HUD is going back and seeing that the expectations were actually met. But that is a very complicated issue, and we do believe that some funding after a certain amount of time should be either recaptured or repurposed.
Recaptured or repurposed. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes my friend and the distinguished gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Albert. Excuse me. My goal today is to hopefully get all of us thinking toward making some corrections and some improvements. And I do think that the HUD program for disaster relief has been successful and is something that we don't need to discontinue unless we find something better. Here's the problem. When there's a disaster, particularly in the Midwest, it's usually going to be a tornado, and in some instances, the Mississippi or the Missouri will come out of its banks and we'll have some flooding. Nothing like what happened on the Gulf Coast or Superstorm Sandy. So what happens is that we have all these the non-entitlement cities that will experience a major problem that devastates and decimates the community, and then FEMA can't step in because the threshold is 8 million. So you get a little town like Orick, which you probably never heard of, which is in my congressional district. There are 800 people. You can wipe out the whole town and not meet the FEMA threshold. So what we have to do then is depend on the state, the non-entitlement dollars that come to the states to be dispersed. That creates a problem if you're talking about trying to respond quickly. And the other problem is the entitlement cities, Kansas City, largest, St. Louis second, Springfield, Independence. I think those are the only entitlement cities in the state. So the money that goes to the state in Jefferson City began to dwindle, and they're not. I mean, the state is not getting, the dollars at a level that the cities are getting anyway. So it reduces the opportunity for HUD dollars to be used in the other small towns. So if you live in a small town, you get slapped with an event, and then you get slapped because you got to go to the state. And I think that's a problem. I think there's some kind of way, FEMA and HUD, we need to work this out so that we don't discriminate against small towns. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Can you fix that? We got 2 minutes for you to fix it.
Well, as the Inspector General, I'll try and talk about it in the framework of what I do. It's interesting because community development block grants for disaster recovery actually don't go to entitlement communities. They go to, the normal funding goes to...
Yes, I know that. That's not, maybe I wasn't clear. Yeah, I know it doesn't go to...
Right.
That's not the problem. I mean, entitlement cities, they'd probably go, as a former mayor, we'd probably go to our rainy day fund, and if there's some housing issue, we'd probably go to CDBG. So that's not what I'm saying is small towns get hit. If the damage is $5 million, they're in trouble. I mean, in terms of some assistance. They got to go to the state. If they get the state money, it's reducing the state pot, which was not designed just for disaster relief.
Right.
It's for all CDBG programs, including, 108 funds and everything else. So small towns get hit. Am I need to fix it some more?
Well, let me say this from the jurisdiction of HUD as it relates to FEMA. One of the things that we are advocating is actually a synthesization of more of the program for at least HUD's perspective as a statutory codification. And these issues could be talked about as HUD makes this a statutory program. What type of funding from CDBG should go to what areas? So if there's an inequity between small and large and who gets more, I mean, this is sort of the problem in Puerto Rico right now, that, the determination has been made that the power goes to the larger cities, and so the smaller areas are not getting it. But these are things that Congress can get involved with if it takes up our recommendation, which is to codify the program, put in statute some sort of language that, from HUD's perspective, and then you can get those issues addressed.
We're on the same page. Maybe we'll get a follow-up. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the Oversight and Investigation Committee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Albert, for taking the time to be here. I wanted to follow up a little bit on one of the answers that she'd had to Chairman Wagner. You made the comment that HUD looks to see if some of the money was used for the intended purposes. And we've noted in the state of Colorado that you have pretty much the policy of maximum feasible deference to the state's interpretation of the statutory requirements. Would you see a benefit from HUD's perspective in terms of being able to establish formal regulations for the CDBG DR requirements? Would that be helpful to HUD in terms of executing the mission when it comes to natural disasters?
Absolutely. So at this juncture, after Harvey and Irma hit, we really took a sort of a lessons learned inward look, and we said, disaster, this was an unprecedented time as far as disasters. 3 hurricanes, fires, other hurricanes coming that were also destructive. And at this time we felt we really need to assess what needs to be done for the future. Because for HUD, when I say it's a peripheral mission, I don't mean that HUD views it as a peripheral, but it's not part of its core statute and not part of what it was founded on in its authorizing language. And so what HUD does is it responds to supplementals per each disaster, and it writes Federal Registry notices, and this is because Congress hasn't directed it to do so. For instance, this happens to be Sandy's. There are 30-something Federal Register notices. There are a lot of Federal Register notices. It needs to have a codification, a core statutory mission, and in that can be described some areas that we know have been abusive and that need clarification, and others where there's a need for flexibility. So what we do tend to find is with maximum feasible deference, there tends to be an overuse of this. And these are things that we would hope as they codify and look to rulemaking that they try to address. We do see that if you do end up codifying the CDBG program, that you will formalize it, get away from these informal guidances, which sometimes are inconsistent from disaster to disaster, and will eliminate some of the delays in implementation. The interesting point is, though, that when we did a review, we did an audit of Sandy money with the entire IG community that's been involved. The top 8 IGs came together. It was surprising that HUD actually surpassed FEMA and other departments in the amount of money it dispersed. And that being so, it really, at this juncture, needs to codify and to accept the fact that, unfortunately, disasters are here to stay for this department and its mission.
Well, when you're talking about the money exceeding what FEMA had even spent, are you comfortable that the dollars were well spent for the intended purpose?
Well, for Sandy money, which is really the last big disaster, which is now 5 years ago, almost exactly to this month, we note that of the $15.2 billion that HUD received from Congress in the supplemental legislation, half is still unexpended. So, like I said in the beginning, it could take 6 to 8 years to redevelop, but half is a great number.
Yeah, and I believe in the state of Colorado, we'd had $320 million of monies that had come in. I believe right now $130 million has been dispersed. They're anticipating that the balance of that will be done by 2019. I think we probably share. I have a little reluctance to try and force it because you just made the comment of overuse of dollars. You don't want them to be directed where they shouldn't be going. Can you describe maybe your idea in terms of how we get that accountability, make sure the dollars are going where they need to and are expended in an appropriate period of time?
So I'll pick a topic that is important, although I don't seem to have a lot of time, and it's a lengthy topic. Maybe we can get it with other members. But one of the areas that we tend to see a problem is in procurement. And procurement's a big area when you're delivering monies out in the supplemental to the states and localities. We tend to see abuses with procurement that really need to be fixed as we go forward. Certainly the experience that we've all read about in the last week with Puerto Rico and the power contract that was given there highlights what IGs across the government see. I think without exception, the top 8 IGs that oversee this program think that procurement and contracting is probably its #1 topic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yield back, Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member, and thank you for being here as our witness today, Ms. Albert. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the disasters, and I noticed in your beginning of your written testimony, you acknowledged that the United States has never seen a hurricane season like the one we just experienced. And for the audience and those who are watching, you're probably making reference to Harvey in Texas, that was a Category 4 that was in August, and then Irma that was a Category 5 that was in September, hitting Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, and then Maria, of course, in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, Category 4 again in September, just a couple weeks apart. I know in part how devastating that was. Right before Maria hit in Puerto Rico, I was there about 10 days before that. having an opportunity to be there and see the beauty of that territory. And so you can imagine how devastating it was. My executive assistant, who works for me in my DC office, that's his home. His parents are there, his grandparents, his godfather, who is the Health and Human Services Director there and a surgeon. And they've all been devastated by this, and not to mention the members of Congress who live in and have families in those states that have been affected by Harvey and Irma and Maria, and then, of course, Nate in Mississippi. So where I'm going with this question, when you talked about how devastating financially this is, with that said, do you think that HUD has enough resources within the department to adequately administer the CDBG disaster relief program, in your opinion?
No, I don't think they have enough resources.
Okay, so in your role and being part of that team, one of the questions when Secretary Carson was here a few weeks ago, as you probably are aware, that he did a minus 15% reduction he requested in his budget for this year. So one of the questions I asked him, because at that time we knew about Harvey and Irma and Maria, so if we don't have enough money, we have been devastated. As a personal note for me, when I look at the $58 billion that we recently passed for Texas, I also feel there's some disparities when you start talking about how communities in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are being treated with the monies that are there. Just this morning, I had an opportunity to listen to the mayor of San Juan, and she talked a lot about infrastructure and the dollars and what they need. So if you, as a part of the team, recognize there's not enough money, I'm going to be like Congressman Cleaver. You have about a minute and a half to tell me how we get the money and how we fix it.
Well, I think there are certain things that can be done first. We talked about the codification, which is an authorizing issue. That's not an appropriating issue. And I think that will create some efficiencies that need to be going forward. Along with that, once you do authorizing language, which this is the Committee of Authorization, so it would have to come from this committee, there will be certain aspects of it as you go to codify the program within HUD that can be discussed, such as we really believe that there needs to be something like a jump team, like something that you see in the military and in law enforcement, where a team of HUD officials come in that are dedicated, not from all these different organizations, but that are dedicated in HUD to going into these localities as these disasters happen. There certainly need to be funding for this. They will be able to take some of it from their existing programs and put it into that. But if you're going to have a amalgamated team that is available to go at any minute, you will have to discuss, along with that authorization, some funding. Mm-hmm.
But I'm hesitant about making HUD pursue this codification in the midst of this disaster effort, because I don't know if they have enough resources to accomplish this. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Trott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witness for her time this morning. And before I get into a few questions, I want to just respond to my friend from Texas's opening remarks regarding Secretary Carson's appearance before our committee. He was here about 4 hours. We have an awful lot of ground to cover. Would agree that we need to have him come back, but I did find his testimony and comments to be some of the more productive hearings we've had. He actually listened to the questions and did his best to respond to our questions, so I can't blame the Secretary for the problems we're discussing today necessarily. But I think it's important we have this conversation because we're talking about a lot of money. These disasters are occurring more frequently, And it's almost inevitable that when a disaster does strike a community, that the response is almost always deemed to be inadequate and too slow, certainly by the people that are affected by the disaster. So it's important. With respect to this program, my concern is it's so fragmented, there's a lack of accountability and lack of transparency, and I wonder preliminarily whether the maximum feasibility deference standard puts the department in a position where there's no adequate way to review the state's performance.
Let me address the first part of your comment, which is fragmentation. I do think that the overall disaster schemata, actually, that has evolved over time with the government response has evolved in a fragmentary manner. It has evolved where programs were in the government, and therefore it was siloed within those programs. Now, for instance, FEMA, this is their mission. This is all they do. This is disaster response. It's emergency response, emergency management. But for the other departments, some of whom actually surpass FEMA in funding, such as HUD, and believe it or not, the Department of Transportation spends more money than FEMA and gets supplemental money more than FEMA, at least for Sandy they did. These are tangential missions, and so they fit within the tranches of whatever they've come from. And so, you know, when you discuss fragmentation, you know, part of the issue is what happens to the homeowner when they have to go to this type of amalgamation and congealing of government agencies. And there's confusion and there are delays. And so, for instance, I'll give you one example. When you go to a disaster recovery center that FEMA runs and you happen to be a resident who's been flooded, you will get funding from FEMA first, food, clothing, repairing your home, at least for you to live in. And then you will go to SBA, to the Small Business Administration. There is an alphabet soup of government agencies that the residents and homeowners have no idea about. And they then meet with SBA. Now, you would think, as I did actually for the longest time until my staff actually corrected me, that if you got an SBA loan, you were a small business. Well, that's not true. You can get a homeowner loan from the Small Business Administration, but here's the problem. If you do, you then are not available because there's a sequence that HUD comes to meet the unmet needs. You will not be able to get a grant from HUD, and a grant is not repayable. So there are these confusions that emanate from the fragmentation of how the disaster program was set up. And they really need to be addressed going forward. That's not to say that the government hasn't gotten better at disaster response. It has. Compared to, I came in to HUD from the HHSIG right after 9/11, and compared to even Katrina, it's a lot different now. However, there are real confusions and inefficiencies that really need to be streamlined and synthesized because the homeowner suffers when that happens.
So it was a great comment and goes to the heart of my concern with this issue as we try and codify a solution. So some poor homeowner doesn't get what they need from HUD, and they go to FEMA. FEMA says it's not our area of responsibility. You need to call HUD or you need to call the SBA. And I know one thing from my days in the business world: if you have an important project or mission that's critical, you need to have someone in charge. At the end of the day, someone needs to be coordinating all of the efforts so that people can't point fingers at each other. And would you say that's a legitimate concern as we approach this problem? Because right now, not only is the poor homeowner confused by the myriad of agencies and departments, but there's no one accountable.
Well, you know, when you're the homeowner and you go into these initial disaster recovery centers, and some of them go early, sometimes going early you can be penalized. Sometimes you're better off waiting because the system right now is not a linear system. It's actually a circuitous system. And depending where you enter can affect where you end up. And there is a lot of confusion. So I think they've gotten better, but there needs to be more done.
I appreciate your comments, and I'm out of time, but I am interested to hear about any instances of criminality that you've discovered in in the IG's office as it relates to fraud. But thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes a gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Albert, you answer in one of your the questions that Ms. Beatty posed to you. You said that more resources are needed to HUD. What do you mean by that? Do you mean increasing additional staffing?
Yes, I think if you could codify this program like we're recommending, and don't forget, we've just come to this recommendation.
Well, so it's good enough. So one area where we could make improvement
Yes.
in terms of your recommendations is increasing the staffing for HUD,
For this area,
for
yes.
this area.
Yes.
So I'm a Puerto Rican American, and all my family is in Puerto Rico. So what is happening in Puerto Rico, there's no other way to describe it. I was just there this weekend. The Puerto Rico that I know no longer exists. People are dying in Puerto Rico because there's no power being restored. 70% of the hospitals are operating with power generators. So my question to you is, I am all for preventing fraud, waste, and abuse. I do not support putting people's lives at risk when natural disaster strikes, right? Just for the sake of preventing fraud and abuse. They need our assistance. The federal government must show up. So do you think that failure to document or the failure to get an independent cost estimate should be justification enough to withhold CDBG DR funds to the citizens of Puerto Rico, many of whom are facing life-threatening conditions? Yes or no?
No, I mean, there has to be some reasonableness on any efforts.
But that is the reality. As of yesterday, the money from the supplemental has not been allocated to Puerto Rico or Texas or Florida because they haven't been able to make the estimates regarding Puerto Rico.
Right. So when HUD gets its supplemental funding, it goes through a calculation of, my understanding, we're not part of that, but from my understanding, there are internal meetings on how unmet needs are, because HUD comes after FEMA and SBA. It typically isn't there in the beginning, although it assists, but it really comes in for the unmet needs. It will then make a determination based on Puerto Rico's situation on what FEMA and the other first responders, in this case SBA, would expend and what the disaster is. But I want to explain something to you, too. I have staff down there. And I have to tell you that it was a very difficult road for us as well. I have half my organization are law enforcement, and the other side are auditors. And I have a presence of both in Puerto Rico. I spent quite a bit of time the first few weeks getting my staff water and getting them food so that they could go out and assess the damage for HUD, because they had law enforcement vehicles. They could go and see what HUD was not able to see. And so they didn't have the basic necessities. The other side of my organization in the last few weeks has been going out to nursing homes and making sure that the elderly, this is an unusual role for the HUD IG. I mean, we're doing what we have to do because it's for the public good. So this situation is a real humanitarian crisis, and I understand that more than most because my own staff have been affected by it.
Well, it is very easy to come here and make the argument that we must be the steward of taxpayers' money. But at what cost? We should not, the issue is, are we looking to the real issues when we are dealing with CDBG DR? We are using arguments just to cut the funding for an agency that has failed American citizens because of the lack of manpower to be able to come up with a report and the estimates that we need in order to allocate the money that will make the people of Puerto Rico whole. That is the real issue here.
Yeah, and I agree with you, they should not be cut.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Albert, for being here today. And I appreciate the comments of my colleague from New York. Have worked in disaster relief and recovery on a volunteer basis for many years. I can't even imagine anybody in America imagining the devastation that Puerto Rico is seeing today. And it is bureaucracy that is clearly in the way of getting the relief to the people. I'm working with some nonprofits right now and trying to get some relief to Puerto Rico, and because of how things are stalled there, it's even hard to get that relief out there. On the other hand, without proper oversight, it also costs lives. I mean, we've seen it time and time again that when the people that the funds are designated to do not receive the funds because it's diverted to another area, it costs lives as well. This is an extreme example, but you don't have to go any further than 1993 in Mogadishu, when the UN was providing food to those that are in need, but the warlords were intercepting that food, and it was never getting to it need to, and it resulted in the incident we know as Blackout Down. So we have to find that way to put that oversight into place. I want to make sure I understand this right. So the funds are given to a grantee who may be a state government, a local government, a city government, et cetera. Then they can grant those funds to a sub-grantee. Who might that be? I mean, what type of entity might that be?
Well, there'll be local agencies, developmental authorities, typical, for instance, if it's in a city, typical agencies that would normally deal with economic development and other things.
Is it ever a private entity? I know in Georgia
Could be.
Okay, it could be, lack of a better term, a developer who actually builds HUD homes. Okay. And I know that you've said that the diversity of HUD projects is part of the problem. So these funds can be used for any HUD type project? Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, they're typically in a disaster, they're typically, because the CDBG program is for an overarching, but this is disaster recovery, they'll do home repair, economic development, infrastructure as well. This is typical of what HUD does, but I do have to mention the one thing as you're talking about the money flowing down. When HUD in the disaster recovery signs an agreement with the state or locality, and then it goes to, as you said, the sub-grantee, it then loses the oversight for the sub-grantee because it signed the agreement with the state or the locality. And so therefore it becomes very difficult to monitor the funds when it goes to that level.
So really the challenge is you can monitor the grantee, but is it the grantee who is responsible to monitor the sub-grantee to make sure the work is done? Are they equipped properly to do that in every case?
No, not always. And so we've actually made a recommendation from our lessons learned. One of the interesting scenarios was after 9/11, when Lower Manhattan was devastated, the city of New York, particularly their Department of Investigations, which is a law enforcement entity, knew that it was going to have issues with reconstruction in Lower Manhattan. It was very worried about organized crime getting involved in the construction of the World Trade Center. And so, therefore, they had a history of vendor problems and had a program where they had these independent or integrity monitors that they called inserted, if they were a large enough sub-grantee, and monitoring. And then they would go back to the states and let them know with eyes on the ground what they were seeing. The only issue with that is that then the state or locality gets the viewpoint of the integrity and independent monitor, but we in the IG and we in HUD lose that. And so we want to make sure that if you are going to require these independent monitors, which we think are a good idea, that we at least get the benefit of knowing what problems they're seeing at the sub-grantee level.
Okay. Within the last few seconds, as we move forward to authorize this and put constraints, what else can HUD and Congress do besides the monitoring to make sure that the funds do go to those who need it and that the proper repair or the money is used for the proper thing?
I think we at our level should have oversight of subgrantees too. We should have some sort of tie to be able to take action if something happens.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Albert, for being here today. I'd like to talk about duplication of benefits and how a well-intentioned practice can sometimes perhaps disadvantage homeowners. As you know, FEMA is often the first place that natural disaster survivors turn for assistance. And during discussions with FEMA about the options available to them, many homeowners are encouraged to also apply through the Small Business Administration for disaster recovery loans. Those who choose to apply are approved for the loan, can then begin the process of rebuilding. Months later, however, that same homeowner may see his or her neighbor who did not seek immediate assistance from the SBA rebuilding their home with a community development block grant, disaster recovery grant, I should say, money that doesn't require a cost share nor needs to be paid back. But when the homeowner first tries to get the same funding, they're denied due to duplication of benefits. Or worse, they're mistakenly approved for CDBG disaster recovery, grant disaster recovery dollars, only to be audited later and forced to repay those funds. In both cases, the homeowner is rightfully upset and often feels perhaps duped by the federal government. I fully agree that it is important to guard against waste. I think we all would, but this seems inherently unfair to those homeowners who seek early assistance in the rebuilding effort, often at the direction of the government. You recommend that the Department of Housing and Urban Development generate guidance to help victims better navigate the programs available to them following a disaster. But because community development block grant disaster recovery funding almost always comes after FEMA and Small Business Administration, shouldn't disaster victims be notified, made aware, if you will, of any potential duplication of benefits from FEMA and the SBA first?
Yes. One easy answer. This issue of the confusion for the homeowner is one that we've brought to the staff here right after Harvey and Irma, but before Maria. We know that there is confusion between particularly the SBA and HUD that needs to be deconflicted. There are inequities that come as a result. Now, technically, the reason that HUD comes after SBA is because SBA loans are supposed to go for higher income who can afford to repay, and the grants, as Ranking Member Green was talking about, are supposed to be given to low and moderate income. That doesn't always happen. They don't always go to the intended, so you could end up with a HUD grant going to somebody who's not low and moderate income, and then the person who ended up getting the loan is disadvantaged because somebody else got a better situation than they did, which is not to have to repay the loan. We absolutely agree that this deconfliction and seamless issue needs to be addressed as you, as the authorizing committee, go forward with how you see disaster across the government. This is a result of what I said is the fragmentation of how the disaster program emanated, primarily after 9/11. Whoever had what function in what department ended up dealing with their programs. Some of them overlapped, some of them didn't. The government has gotten better at trying to make it more of a seamless scenario. However, like I said, it's not a linear route. It's a circuitous route. And when you come into it at different aspects of it, you could be disadvantaged. And that's why I think you need to redress that.
We, the Congress.
Yes. HUD right now deals, like I said, with it in the federal registries because it's never been directed in a statute. And it will look to the supplemental, and it will look to the guidance that comes from the supplemental. Sometimes it's very broad and it's very general, and they will, this is why they give the maximum feasible deference, they won't put a lot of specificity in it. And so you'll end up with the inequities that are already built into the system if you don't have at least the ground rules set out.
So it's not in statute currently,
For HUD,
right? It's a reg?
it's dealt with by Federal Registry notices.
Could it be fixed there then?
I think that the more Federal Registry notices you use, the more inconsistency you will find from disaster to disaster.
That's unfortunate. Okay, thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired, and it is unfortunate. It's no way to govern by Federal Register or to have oversight. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Albert, for being here this morning. If you could, and I'll maybe dial it back a little bit, can you explain the role of the CDBG-DR and specifically why the program exists considering the number of other programs designed to provide similar relief among different agencies?
Well, the CDBG program, which has traditionally been the HUD program, is the preeminent community development block grant out there. So while FEMA responds to disasters and emergency management, eventually they leave, and it's HUD that really stays. So when you talk about the 6 to 8 years of a traditional redevelopment after a disaster, is really HUD that's there. And that's because of the Community Development Block Grant, which was set to make economic and community development.
Ms. Albert, are you familiar, or can you speak to the level of coordination in disaster relief efforts between HUD, FEMA, and SBA?
Sure. So when a disaster initially hits, FEMA is the first in, under the Stafford Act, which is the governing statute for disasters. And it will come in and it will set up a number of systems, disaster recovery centers for residents and those affected to come into, joint operations command centers, and so forth. And it will pull in from the federal government staff, which is exactly what happened to us in the beginning because, as I said, half my organization is law enforcement. We then fell under the public safety and security and did sort of non-traditional IG roles, but we were, under the Stafford Act, required to do that. We went out and did search and rescue. We did other functions, including force protection. So that's initial. Then as time goes on and you get sort of past the immediate after effects, other areas start taking over, and that's really where HUD comes in. It is the long-term economic development and revitalization of a disaster area. But in the initial stages, it's really FEMA, and depending on the various support functions, it's different departments. So for instance, under public safety and security, which is called ESF 13, which you always have an acronym in the government, that is ATF that coordinates for all of the federal, and they're set up in various support functions of who takes over and what. But that is very short term. Eventually, there's the long term, which is where we're at with Sandy right now, 5 years out, and it's really the CDBG that's there.
Again, along those lines, and I'll tell you, I'm a lawyer, was a lawyer before I was elected to Congress, and in legal terms, sometimes you talk about forum shopping, where you try to pick a particular court that you think may be better inclined to handle your matters. Not that I ever did anything like that. But do you ever see any forum shopping or venue shopping, if you will, between grantees seeking the best deal between these various agencies?
Well, as a law enforcement agency, we absolutely do see fraud. And we see it in a number of different ways. First of all, getting to the forms, and you saying that you're an attorney, one of the things that we really try to insist, it doesn't always happen, but HUD has been very good when we point it out to them. We want to make sure that those forms that people sign have the correct certifications on them, that actually say that you're certifying that what you're signing for is truthful, that you are the actual homeowner and so forth. If those certifications aren't in the form, it's very difficult to prosecute later on for actual improper activities. So that's a preventative thing. But we do see issues of fraud with in a variety of different ways. You're not supposed to seek monies to rebuild if your home is a vacation home, for instance. But yet we have people seeking monies which are supposed to be for low and moderate income who have vacation homes and are saying that their home was destroyed and they live there year-round and they're low and moderate income and so forth. Those absolutely do happen.
Thank you, Ms. Albert. Now I see that my time is expiring. I'll yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now recognizes the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'd like to thank the witness for appearing. I have great respect for this witness, and I greatly appreciate what you've done in Puerto Rico. You indicated that you dispatched some of your personnel to Puerto Rico to acquire information such that HUD could react rapidly. Can you say just a little bit more about this? I think it's important for us to know. And by the way, before you do, you don't work for HUD. I think the record needs to have a clear indication that you do not. Is that a fair statement? You don't work for HUD?
Yes, inspector generals are independent entities within the executive branch, and we're actually sort of strange creatures because we actually report to Congress. So we sit and reside in the executive branch, but we have a dual responsibility to report to Congress.
Thank you. Now, if you would, Puerto Rico and some of the things that you've been able to accomplish.
So early on, with the humanitarian crisis that was happening in Puerto Rico, we have had a limited staff in Puerto Rico. So unfortunately, over the years, our staff itself has gone down, and so we've had to diminish some of our actual field offices, and Puerto Rico was one of them, although we still had a presence. We were trying quickly because we knew that HUD was not able to get around and frankly was having a great deal of difficulty even finding its own staff. So we would go out in the first days after Maria to try and locate HUD staff, let the department know that its staff was okay. Many of them were in shelters, they had evacuated, and just let them know that they were there and where they were. So that was the very, very beginning, was actually locating people. After that, we went into and did a variety of things. We, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, were part of the Viejito Task Force, which tried to deal with the issue of hoarding, which always happens in a disaster when there's limited fuel and supplies. We went into nursing homes, Section 202 and Section 232 facilities that are HUD, but others as well, to make sure that the situation that happened with Irma in Florida, where the horrible nursing home situation happened, didn't happen in Puerto Rico. So we took valued water, supplies, and other things with our agents, and we had to go, unfortunately, with our agents because we had to protect the trucks, but not only that, we had to navigate the streets, which were dangerous, with downed wires and other things, to get those things to the elderly and disabled.
Permit me to intercede for just a moment because your list is rather extensive and I greatly appreciate all that you're saying. Notwithstanding all that was done, and you have obviously made a Herculean effort, but notwithstanding all that's done, we can visually see that there is still great work to be done in Puerto Rico. I heard General Honoré, who was in Louisiana after Katrina, literally was in charge of a good amount of the disaster recovery effort. He indicated that circumstances such as what we see in Puerto Rico might require a lot more flexibility. The accountability obviously should be there, but it might require a lot more flexibility. Now, he used a term that I'm not suggesting that we use, and I don't think he meant it literally. Maybe he did. But he said, listen, just let the person who needs to make the request just write it out on a piece of paper and just send it in because of the dire circumstances that are having to be dealt with. At some point, in places like Puerto Rico, we have to dispatch more of our resources, and we have to do it in a much more expeditious fashion. I appreciate greatly what you were trying to do to help acquire the intelligence, but somehow we cannot leave people stranded in the middle of the ocean, as has been called to our attention. We really have to find a way to get help in as quickly as possible. And on that point of getting help to them, in my district, we had a town meeting. And for us to explain to my constituents what was available, we had to bring in 9 people to explain. And at the end, I am convinced that people were thoroughly confused. After having all of this siloed information presented, it's just overwhelming. And you're trying to get back home. Your kids are at some place where they are probably being kept by someone. Somehow we have to do more for Puerto Rico. Can you just quickly give some indication, based on your observations, as to how we might move expeditiously?
So it's always a balancing act. Obviously, there's a great humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico that exists that's unique to that area. And getting people just basic necessities, food, electricity, water is paramount. By the same token, we also have to look to the fact that the capacity of Puerto Rico to now take the vast amounts of billions of dollars that are going to come, that those structures that need to be set up, and they do there because they're in bankruptcy and they have some problem agencies, need to be done quickly, but done well with good accounting principles and other things, so that just take the lessons learned. Disasters, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Disasters have occurred, 9/11, Katrina, Sandy. Take those lessons, make sure that you have the best of those, and put it in place where you know that there will be capacity issues.
Gentleman's time
Madam
has
Chair.
expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tenney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wagner, and I really appreciate the Inspector General, Ms. Albert, being here today to discuss and examine the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, which is intended to deliver emergency help to communities and neighborhoods with limited resources post-natural disaster to help rebuild their livelihood. I just want to make that really clear. Over the last decade, the Housing and Urban Development Inspector General has audited grantees, which include states and local governments, where they found many areas this program can improve on to be run more efficiently. And I heard your testimony earlier. Obviously, I have numerous sheets of some of the work you've done, which looks very comprehensive, and some issues my colleague mentioned about some of the Sandy funding not coming out. I'm really happy to report that with all the natural disasters, and particularly in the flooding realm, that there's none of my local communities or anyone in my district that's been reported as not getting their funding out. But there's a couple things I just wanted to talk to you about as the Inspector General, and one of them is the thresholds in determining how we get to some of the disaster aid for, especially in my community. It seems that the flooding and the natural disasters we have almost cruelly go to the poorer areas and the poorer neighborhoods, and they're the ones that need the most resources. And I've walked through the muddy streams, I've walked into cellars where the basements are 5 feet of mud, and these people don't have the resources. How do we get around I don't want to say get around, but get to the threshold so they actually meet, some of them are dollar amounts, some are per capita. How would you recommend we actually get to some of these people who are caught without having and especially in an area like mine where our values are much lower than, say, New York City or other areas?
Well, first of all, to get to your point about some of the poor communities often flood, this unfortunately is a reality. You saw it with Katrina, New Orleans. Some of the areas that have been developed that are the poorer areas were in the 9th Ward were flood zones, and this is why they flood. They were built in flood zones. We see this, unfortunately, even with public housing, that they're built in, some of them in flood zones, which gets to another issue which we've audited, which is that public housing sometimes doesn't buy flood insurance even though they're in a flood zone. But as far as the inequities of receiving funding, HUD's allocation, when it gets a supplemental and it goes to CDBGR, CDBG is formula-based, but CDBG-R is a whole different allocation. And it looks to FEMA and SBA and the first responders, and it sees what unmet needs are there. And then it makes a decision based on what it has determined the destruction has been in a particular area, and then it goes into a calculation of what is the unmet need. I think that if you feel that there's inequities, again, this is not a statutory program, so it's an interpretation by them and federal registries over statute, over supplemental language.
If I may just say, one of my concerns is that our local governments have taken a lot of the burden in my region, and some of our local officials have actually become quite knowledgeable on some of the disasters, especially related to flooding. And it seems that when the federal government comes in, we don't take into account their local knowledge and their ability to solve the problem. And I'm wondering if that's something the Inspector General can dive in and say, look, these guys know what's going on. How can we give them the opportunity to provide the solutions and then better spend the money that's coming in? And often we find that, you know, tens of thousands of dollars come in on projects that could have been solved. You know, we've already studied these, we've analyzed them, and sometimes our input isn't taken into consideration. Is that something that we can do through your office, or we can fix? Because it's a huge problem.
I think that this is an issue you can discuss when you talk about codification in an authorizing language. Because typically under CDBG disaster recovery funding, it'll go to the states, as opposed to an entitlement community, which could be lower a locality, which is where traditional CDBG goes. So this inequity rises because you have different funding streams of who gets the money. And maybe this is something that you could discuss while you're dealing with your authorizing language.
Yeah, thank you, because we do need to focus on so many of these communities. We know what we should have done, could have done, it doesn't get done, and then we have, you know, a few years later, a heavy rain, not even a major storm, and we are in catastrophic flooding again, like we experienced this year in my district on July 1st. And where's the federal government? They're still tied up. We're still not responding the way we should be to our needy communities. And I do thank you. My time's expired, but I thank you very much for your great testimony. Thanks.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. And in addition to thanking you for being here, thank you for the hard work that you put in every day, you and your team. I know that you do that with a great amount of diligence. You can see that in your testimony here today and the way that you're thoughtfully answering questions and your focus on ensuring not only that we do everything we can to help those that need it, but also that we do everything we can to be good, thoughtful stewards of taxpayer dollars. You know, from a bigger picture perspective that I wanted to ask about, what I've kind of heard throughout the course of your testimony today and some of the questions my colleagues have been asking is, you know, in the event that we respond to something like this, we being the federal government, right? There are two big risks and concerns, right? One is that there's a lot of overlap and duplicative work and resources that are put to the same missions. In other words, the two circles of the Venn diagram are too much overlapped, right? But then there's also another big risk, right? That those circles don't overlap at all and people fall through the cracks and aren't able to get the resources that they want. And you and certainly the department overall are trying to find the place where you can marry those two up at exactly the point where there's no overlap, no duplicative waste of resources, but also that no one falls through the cracks. And so really what I wanted to ask first was, have you encountered any challenges inside the department in being able to execute upon your mission of ensuring that there are stewards of taxpayer dollars thinking through at each of these points? Is there anything that we need to provide you, resources or tools, to help you and your office accomplish their mission more thoroughly throughout the department itself?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, nobody takes the job of an inspector general because they want to win a popularity contest. I'll be honest with you, it's maybe one of the toughest jobs in government because you're criticizing programs, but you're criticizing them in a way that you hope to make them better.
Right.
But of course, the message is not always one that's well received by many. You know, from the Inspector General's perspective, it has been a tough road for us. Not only have we now had to deal with natural disasters, but frankly, HUD during the great economic crisis after 2011 was frankly the major entity supporting the economy through housing. I don't know if people realize that FHA became 30% of the mortgage industry at that point for new home sales. And when you add refinances in, it was as high as 70%. Concurrently, while it has had to oversee that, for instance, I have to oversee $1.5 trillion FHA fund and $1.5 trillion Ginnie Mae remaining principal balance. That's $3 trillion, including HUD's $48 billion regular appropriation and $47 billion disaster.
Yeah.
When Sandy started, I had 711 staff. Today, I have 574.
Right.
So you can see that something gives.
Right.
And while I'm very proud of our organization, we return more than $60 in the last few years to the government for every dollar you spend on us.
Yeah.
You know, there's only so much we can look at.
Right. Is it just a question of resources, or do you need more of a cultural shift or a push from Congress, and how important your role is, how important auditing generally is, how important the Inspector General role can be?
Well, one thing I have to say about this committee has always been, as our authorizing committee, very supportive of the Inspector General. We've enjoyed a great relationship, you know, as our authorizers. But I think there's more things that this committee, as an authorizing committee, could do to help maybe alleviate, and certainly in this area, not only just codification, extending our oversight to subgrantees, you know, ensuring that procurement rules are met, because we know there can be great abuse in procurement. I mean, these are really things that could help facilitate us and would actually help our dialogue with the department. Now, I can say that I meet regularly with the secretary. And as a matter of fact, I have a meeting with him tomorrow. And he and I have had conversations about the critical juncture we're at right now and the need to do something different.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that, and I think that certainly maybe many people see you and your role as a problem. I see it as the key to the solution in ensuring that we accomplish the mission that we want, but also do it effectively. My good friend and colleague that also sits on this committee, not this subcommittee, French Hill, this is a matter of passion for him as well. I know that he's done a great amount of work after Katrina as president of the Rotary Club, Cooperative of Baptist Fellowship, and ensuring that homes were rebuilt down in Louisiana, and he was astounded to see what he felt like was a waste of resources and not long-term sustainably helping individuals build above the floodplain so they wouldn't have this issue again. And so he and I are going to continue to work together to do everything we can to support you in your role and the department generally in accomplishing its mission, but also in being a good steward. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen, time has expired. I'm going to take a point of privilege from the chair and recognize my good friend from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for a quick follow-up question, please.
Thank you. Let me thank you, Madam Chair, for the hearing, and thank the IG for being here. In many ways, some of the questions, maybe the majority of the questions we ask were not what you do. I mean, we put you in a position in defending HUD. But I want to go back to what you might be able to do. And you talked about the fragmentation, which is what I was trying to talk about earlier. If Mayview is hit by a disaster, Mayview, Missouri, in my district, 222 people. If we follow the law, I mean, CDBG, I know a little bit about CDBG, so I know the requirements. If we follow the regulations, before Mayview can get federal assistance, there is supposed to be a presidential declaration. There's not been a presidential declaration for any of these small towns that have had disasters. I mean, and there is also a requirement that HUD requirement for a community hearing, and I think you guys probably are the people that check up on this. It's supposed to be a community hearing. You're supposed to have a written notice of the hearing, and the plan is supposed to be presented. None of that happens. we have a problem. I've seen it firsthand. I've talked about it. I don't know what we can do. In your, looking at your recommendation, the legislative recommendation, and maybe it's all entangled into your recommendations, but there needs to probably be some clarity. This is a problem, and it's just a matter of time. We're going to have another situation where, in Biloxi, Mississippi, the ranking member, I went down there right after Katrina. They rebuilt a yacht dock for yachts. People downtown, the windows were still out of stores. Anyway, this is frustrating. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to.
Can I make one point, though? You're
Yes,
absolutely
please.
right that for HUD, you have to have a presidentially declared disaster zone for them to come in traditionally after FEMA and SBA. FEMA can come in when they, I don't know if I have this title correct, when there's an emergency zone created so that they can pre-position and get in before the disaster. So like when Harvey was hitting, they would get in there before. This is why I'm recommending that HUD actually have these jump teams so that they can get in and do what they have to. And this may be part of your authorizing languages. When does HUD come and does it have to wait for the declared zone? So.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his secondary question, and I thank you, Ms. Albert, for your testimony today and the wonderful collaboration between your office and the Oversight and Investigation Committee here of Financial Services. You know, and I know we've varied in some of our questioning here today with you, and knowing that Congress thus far in the 115th Congress has only authorized and appropriated, in fact, $7.5 billion in community development block grant disaster recovery funds, and they were specifically, I know, for Harvey and Irma. Many of us spoke today about the horrific conditions and tragedy and devastation in Puerto Rico, knowing that there are not specific CDBG-DR funds that have been appropriated there yet. I just thank you for your perspective on some of the ways that we can work together to reform the system. The ranking member and I are committed to working together to come up to some of your recommendations, some of your thoughts about how we can streamline this so that in the end, this money does in fact reach those who need it the most, and that we are, while remaining good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. So I thank you, Ms. Albert, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. I ask our witness to please respond as promptly as they are able, and this hearing is now adjourned.